They handed her the baby without hesitation. A quiet house, a trusted routine. When they came home, everything looked normal. Too normal. The babysitter had a story. Simple, believable. But as the hours passed, one question refused to go away. If nothing went wrong, why did the evidence say otherwise? Stay with us, because when the truth finally surfaced, it shattered far more than one family.
Welcome to Unimaginable True Crimes. Here, we expose the unimaginable, one case at a time.
It began the way so many tragedies do, with trust. The kind of trust that doesn't feel risky because it's wrapped in routine. The kind of trust that grows quietly, day by day, until no one remembers what doubt feels like. In a comfortable suburban home outside Boston, a family welcomed help into their lives. They were busy professionals, parents trying to balance careers and a growing household. Like millions of families before them, they turned to a caregiver, someone young, responsible, recommended, someone who seemed safe. Her name was Louise Woodward. Louise was 18 years old, British, soft-spoken, polite. She had come to the United States as an au pair, a common arrangement in the 1990s. Families opened their homes, young caregivers helped with children. Cultural exchange wrapped in domestic normalcy. To the outside world, Louise fit perfectly. She smiled easily. She followed rules. She blended into the household routine without resistance. There was nothing about her that set off alarms. And that's important, because when we look back at cases like this, we want warning signs, something obvious, something we can point to and say, there it was. But in the beginning, there was nothing. The family home was calm, orderly, predictable. Baby toys neatly arranged, a nursery prepared with care, the kind of place where chaos felt distant. This wasn't a troubled household. There were no screaming matches, no visible instability, which made the events that followed even harder to accept, because danger feels impossible in places like this. Louise's days followed a rhythm, feeding, changing, rocking a baby to sleep. She wasn't left alone immediately. Trust was built gradually. Parents observed, asked questions, watched how she handled stress, and she appeared calm, competent, reliable. Over time, they began to leave her alone with their infant son. Nothing unusual, nothing reckless, just routine. Matthew was just 8 months old, too young to speak, too young to explain pain, too young to tell anyone what happened. He relied completely on the adults around him. And on the evening that would change everything, only one adult was present, Louise. It was an ordinary night. Parents left the house believing their child was safe, believing they would return to the same quiet normalcy they always did. When they came home, the scene didn't scream disaster. No overturned furniture, no obvious signs of struggle, just a babysitter waiting and a baby who was unresponsive. Louise said she didn't know what happened. She explained that Matthew had been fussy, that she had put him down, that when she checked on him again, something was wrong. It sounded plausible. Babies get sick, they choke, they collapse without warning. Emergency services were called. Doctors rushed to intervene. But within hours, the tone changed, because doctors began to see injuries that didn't match the story. Hospital staff noticed swelling, internal bleeding, signs that suggested trauma. Suddenly, this wasn't just a medical emergency, it was an investigation, and Louise's calm explanation no longer fit neatly with what scans revealed. The gap between story and science widened, quietly at first, then rapidly. Louise was questioned again. Her answers stayed mostly the same. She didn't panic, she didn't flee, but consistency doesn't always equal truth. Investigators began asking harder questions. Had she dropped the baby? Had he fallen? Had something happened she wasn't admitting? Each question chipped away at the illusion. At just 18, Louise found herself isolated. No family nearby, no lifelong support system, a foreign legal system closing in. She maintained her innocence. She insisted she loved the baby, that she would never hurt him. But the evidence didn't seem to listen. Word spread quickly. An English au pair, an American baby, a death that made no sense. The story exploded. Tabloids framed her as a monster. Others framed her as a scapegoat. Public opinion split almost instantly. And long before a jury was selected, minds were already made up. Louise didn't look like what people expected. She wasn't hardened. She wasn't aggressive. She looked like a teenager overwhelmed by circumstances she didn't understand. And that made everything more confusing. Because if she wasn't guilty, then how do you explain the injuries? And if she was, how did no one see it coming? From the start, this case refused to be simple. A trusted caregiver, a loving family, medical evidence pointing in one direction, a story pointing in another. Someone was wrong, but figuring out who would take years and divide the world. Here is the contradiction that haunts this case. Louise was either a violent killer hiding in plain sight, or a young woman trapped by misunderstood science and assumption. There was no middle ground, and the truth would destroy lives either way. The babysitter's story sounded believable, until it didn't, and once doubt crept in, it never left. Before we continue, if you've been following the story so far, please take one moment to support the channel. Like this video, turn on notifications, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes.
At first, everyone wanted this to be simple. A medical emergency, a tragic accident, a baby who slipped away without warning. Those explanations are easier to live with. But as doctors spoke quietly among themselves, something didn't sit right. And when certainty cracks, suspicion rushes in to fill the space. Inside the hospital, the focus shifted from saving a life to understanding what had happened. Doctors examined scans, reviewed injuries, compared notes. What they saw didn't match a sudden illness. There was swelling in the brain, bleeding beneath the skull, signs that suggested force, not fate. No one said the words out loud at first, but the implication hung in the air. Someone may have hurt the baby. Matthew was only 8 months old, too young to explain pain, too young to say who held him last, too young to tell anyone what happened in those final moments. All the answers had to come from adults, and that narrowed the focus quickly, because only one adult had been with him, the babysitter. Police returned to Louise Woodward with more questions. Had the baby fallen? Had she shaken him while trying to calm him? Had anything at all, gone wrong? Louise repeated her story. She hadn't hurt him. She hadn't dropped him. She didn't know why he stopped breathing. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't contradict herself. But consistency alone wasn't enough anymore. Doctors introduced a term that would become the backbone of the case: shaken baby syndrome. At the time, it was widely accepted, a diagnosis used to explain certain patterns of injury in infants: bleeding, swelling, neurological collapse. To prosecutors, it fit perfectly: an overwhelmed babysitter, a crying baby, a moment of lost control. But science is never as clean as courtrooms want it to be. Not every doctor agreed. Some specialists questioned timelines. Others debated whether the injuries could have occurred earlier. Still others raised doubts about how definitive the diagnosis really was. These disagreements weren't front-page news, but they mattered. Because when expert opinions clash, certainty collapses, and the case began to wobble. Louise was questioned repeatedly. The tone shifted. What began as information gathering turned into interrogation. Her youth became a liability. Her calmness was reinterpreted as coldness. Her confusion was framed as evasion. In a foreign country, under intense pressure, every word she spoke was scrutinized, and every pause was suspect. Investigators latched on to small details, the timing of events, the sequence of checks on the baby, the moment she realized something was wrong. These weren't major contradictions, they were inconsistencies, the kind that can happen under stress. But once doubt takes hold, inconsistencies become evidence, and the narrative began to shift publicly. News outlets picked up the story fast. A foreign babysitter, a dead American baby, medical experts pointing toward abuse. Headlines hardened opinions before facts were settled. Louise was no longer a teenager caught in tragedy. She was a suspect, and the public followed the script eagerly. Matthew's parents were devastated. Their world had collapsed overnight. In that kind of grief, certainty becomes survival. If this wasn't an accident, if someone caused this, then someone had to be held responsible. That emotional reality shaped everything that followed, because unanswered grief demands resolution. Later, prosecutors would point to moments they called warning signs. Louise's inexperience, her youth, her emotional detachment in interviews. But at the time those moments happened, they didn't feel like red flags. They felt human. And that's what made this case so dangerous, because the line between behavior and suspicion blurred. Charges were filed. The shift from investigation to prosecution happened rapidly. Some experts would later argue it happened too fast, that alternative explanations weren't fully explored, that timelines were assumed, not proven. But once a case gains momentum, slowing it down becomes nearly impossible. Louise now faced something far bigger than herself: American courts, American juries, American media. Her accent made her stand out, her youth made her vulnerable, and her insistence on innocence made some people angrier, because certainty is comforting, ambiguity is not. Medical testimony hardened into camps. One side insisted the injuries could only have happened minutes before collapse, which meant Louise had to be responsible. The other side suggested earlier injury, alternative medical explanations, possibility instead of certainty. The jury would be asked to choose, not between facts, but between experts. As trial preparations continued, cracks widened in the medical timeline, in the investigative assumptions, in the public narrative. But by then, the damage was done. The babysitter's story didn't add up, at least not to people who had already decided what the truth should be. Even among those convinced of guilt, a question lingered. Why did this case feel so unstable? Why did certainty rely so heavily on interpretation? And why did the science seem to change depending on who was speaking? Those questions would not disappear. They would only grow louder. The warning signs were there. Or maybe they weren't warning signs at all, just assumptions dressed in evidence. Comment below. Would you have noticed the warning signs? Or would you have believed the story you were told? Because next, the case explodes in open court, and what happens there will shock everyone watching.
The courtroom was quiet in the way that only heavy rooms can be. No whispers, no rustling papers, just breath held behind wooden benches. This was the moment the story stopped being private, the moment grief, suspicion, and science collided in public view. And for the first time, the question wasn't what happened, it was who caused it. Prosecutors didn't open with emotion, they opened with certainty. They told the jury this was not an accident, not a mystery, not a tragedy without a culprit. They said an infant had been violently shaken, that the injuries were unmistakable, and that only one person could have done it: the babysitter.
Across the courtroom sat Louise Woodward, barely out of her teens, listening as her name became synonymous with violence. The prosecution walked jurors through the evening minute by minute. Parents leaving the house, a baby in good health, a babysitter alone. Then the sudden emergency call. They described a narrow window, a critical time frame in which the injuries must have occurred. According to their experts, that window pointed directly to Louise. No room for doubt, no room for alternatives. The story was clean. Too clean. Doctors testified with confidence. They described swelling in the brain, bleeding behind the eyes, patterns they said could only come from violent shaking. To a jury unfamiliar with medical nuance, it sounded definitive. This wasn't opinion, this was science. And science, like people, can disagree. The defense didn't deny the tragedy. They didn't deny the injuries. They challenged when those injuries occurred. And that single question changed everything. What if the damage happened earlier? What if symptoms were delayed? What if the baby had been injured days before the night Louise babysat? Suddenly, certainty fractured. Expert after expert took the stand. Some supported the prosecution's timeline, others dismantled it piece by piece. They spoke of evolving medical understanding, of misdiagnosis, of how shaken baby conclusions were not as settled as jurors were led to believe. The courtroom transformed into a battleground of credentials, degrees versus degrees, experience versus experience. The jury wasn't deciding between truth and lies, they were choosing which experts to believe. Louise's behavior became evidence. Her demeanor, her accent, her reactions. She didn't cry enough or cried at the wrong moments. She sounded detached or confused. She didn't fit the image people expected of grief. But behavior isn't proof, and yet it carried weight. Because juries don't just listen, they watch. Under questioning, some prosecution experts faltered. Timelines shifted, language softened, absolute statements became probabilities. Those changes mattered, because once certainty weakens, doubt rushes in, and doubt is dangerous for both sides. Matthew's parents sat through every word, every argument, every possibility raised. For them, this wasn't an academic debate, it was their child. And the defense's suggestions that injuries may have occurred earlier, that responsibility was unclear, felt like reopening wounds. The courtroom wasn't just weighing evidence, it was balancing grief against doubt. Jurors were instructed to focus on facts, but facts were slippery. Medical opinions conflicted, timelines overlapped, emotions ran high. They were asked to decide guilt beyond reasonable doubt, in a case where reasonable doubt lived everywhere. When the verdict came, the room froze. Guilty. The word landed hard. Louise was convicted. The babysitter's story in the eyes of the court did not add up. And just like that, a teenager became a convicted killer. The reaction was immediate. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt something was deeply wrong. Medical experts spoke out. International outrage followed. Protests erupted. The case didn't settle, it ignited. The judge later reduced the conviction, acknowledged uncertainty, questioned the science, lowered the charge. But the damage was done. Louise had been tried, convicted, branded, and the public wasn't ready to let go. Because the trial didn't answer the biggest question, it multiplied it. If the science was uncertain, if the timeline was disputed, if experts couldn't agree, then what really happened that night? And how many other cases were built the same way? This is where the story fractures. Was the crime the act itself, or was it the rush to judgment? Was justice done, or merely decided? Because once a verdict is read, truth doesn't stop evolving. The jury had spoken, but science hadn't finished talking. And the most disturbing detail, the one that would haunt this case for decades, hadn't even been fully understood yet.
After the verdict, the case should have slowed. Justice, in theory, had been delivered, a conviction secured, A tragedy explained. But instead of settling, the story began to unravel. Because the closer people looked at the investigation, the more uncomfortable questions emerged. With Louise Woodward convicted, attention moved from what happened to how it was decided. Legal analysts revisited the trial transcripts. Medical professionals re-examined the evidence. Journalists began asking what had been overlooked. And what they found was not corruption in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more dangerous: assumption. From the earliest hours of the investigation, focus narrowed quickly. One caregiver, one timeline, one explanation. Once investigators decided the injuries must have occurred during Louise's watch, every subsequent decision aligned with that belief. Alternative possibilities weren't dismissed outright. They simply weren't pursued with the same urgency. That's how tunnel vision works. It doesn't hide facts, it deprioritizes them. At the heart of the case was shaken baby syndrome. In the 1990s, it was widely accepted, taught, trusted. But science evolves, and even then it was not universally agreed upon. Some experts had already begun questioning whether the triad of symptoms, swelling, bleeding, neurological collapse, could only come from shaking. Those voices were present, they just weren't amplified, because courts prefer certainty over nuance. One of the most critical assumptions in the case was timing. Prosecutors argued the injuries must have occurred minutes before Matthew collapsed. That timing placed responsibility squarely on Louise. But defense experts pointed to medical literature suggesting delayed symptoms were possible, hours, even days. If that were true, the entire foundation of the case shifted. Suddenly, the question wasn't, did she do it? It was, when did it happen? And investigators had never truly answered that. As the case was re-examined, small details took on new weight. Notes that had been skimmed, statements that had been interpreted narrowly, medical records that allowed more than one conclusion. None of it proved innocence, but it undermined certainty, and certainty was what the conviction relied on. For many observers, the betrayal wasn't by Louise, it was by the system. Parents trusted medical expertise, jurors trusted expert witnesses, the public trusted that justice meant truth. But when experts later contradicted each other publicly, trust fractured. Because if science could be wrong here, where else had it been wrong? Then came a moment that stunned many. The judge intervened. He acknowledged the uncertainty, questioned the conclusiveness of the medical testimony, and reduced the conviction. It was a rare admission, not of innocence, but of doubt. And doubt in a murder case is seismic. Some asked why the conviction wasn't overturned entirely. The answer was complicated. Appeals require new evidence, not new interpretations. And while science was shifting, it hadn't yet crossed the threshold courts demanded. The system had moved too far forward to turn back easily. That's another betrayal, structural, not personal. As doubt spread, media coverage changed tone. Stories once framed around guilt now questioned fairness. International attention grew. Medical journals weighed in. Advocacy groups raised alarms. The narrative fractured, and with it, public confidence. Investigators hadn't set out to frame anyone. They had followed the best knowledge available at the time. But being first to explain a tragedy can be dangerous, because once a story is told convincingly, it resists revision. And in this case, revision was overdue. Through it all, Louise remained a symbol. To some, she was guilty beyond doubt. To others, a cautionary tale of overconfidence. Her life had been permanently altered. Even as questions mounted, the verdict lingered. Justice delayed is painful. Justice questioned is devastating. This wasn't just a story about one babysitter. It exposed how investigations can harden too quickly, how science can be oversimplified, how juries can be asked to decide debates experts haven't settled. Those revelations extended far beyond this courtroom. They reshaped conversations nationwide. The evidence was real, the tragedy undeniable, but the certainty? That was built on assumptions that no longer felt solid.
Do you believe the investigators got this right, or did they miss something that can never be corrected? Because the final chapter doesn't bring answers, it brings consequences. When the courtroom finally emptied, nothing felt finished. There was no sense of relief, no clean emotional landing, only silence and a question that refused to stay buried. Legally, the case was over. The conviction had been reduced, the sentence adjusted, the appeals exhausted. On paper, the system had spoken, but in reality, the story was just beginning. Because this was one of those cases where the verdict did not bring understanding, it fractured it. After her release, Louise Woodward returned to England. No cameras followed her through quiet streets. No closure waited at the airport. She was no longer a defendant, but she was not free. Her name had become permanent shorthand for controversy, her face forever tied to tragedy. She did not give victory speeches. She did not claim vindication. She disappeared from public life. And that disappearance was telling. For Matthew's parents, there was no after. There was only loss. No ruling could undo it. No debate could soften it. They had buried their child. They had trusted a system to explain why, and what they received instead was uncertainty layered on grief. For families like theirs, doubt isn't intellectual, it's cruel, because unanswered questions reopen wounds that never fully heal. This story did not stay local. It crossed borders. In the United States, many believed justice had been served, imperfect but necessary. In the United Kingdom, outrage dominated headlines. To some, Louise was a scapegoat. To others, a guilty party who escaped full punishment. The divide was sharp, and it has never closed. Years later, medical understanding continued to evolve. Shaken baby syndrome became a topic of fierce debate. Alternative explanations gained traction. New research complicated old conclusions. None of that changed the verdict, but it changed the context, which raised an uncomfortable truth. Some cases are decided before science catches up, and once decided, they don't move easily. No official apology was ever issued, no formal acknowledgement of error, but there were signals, judicial commentary, carefully worded rulings, subtle distancing from earlier certainty. The system didn't say, "We were wrong," but it did say, "We are no longer sure." And that distinction matters more than it seems. This wasn't just about one babysitter. It became a reference point. For prosecutors, a reminder of overconfidence. For defense attorneys, a warning about medical certainty. For judges, a lesson in restraint. The case reshaped how infant injury prosecutions were approached. More caution, more skepticism, more questions. But that evolution came too late for the people at the center of this story. There is a possibility no one likes to say out loud, that the full truth may never be known, that Matthew's injuries may never be explained with absolute certainty, that the night he collapsed may remain medically ambiguous forever. And that means the story cannot resolve itself cleanly, because ambiguity is not justice and certainty is no longer available. Louise lost her youth. Matthew lost his life. A family lost their child. Two nations lost trust in easy answers. There are no winners here, only consequences, and consequences that ripple far beyond one courtroom. This case forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality, that good intentions do not guarantee truth, that expertise does not equal infallibility, that justice systems are built by humans, and humans make assumptions. It also reminds us that fear of uncertainty can be more powerful than evidence and far more dangerous, because this story isn't really about guilt or innocence anymore. It's about process, about how quickly suspicion hardens, how science is simplified for juries, how narratives overpower nuance, and how once a story makes sense, people stop questioning it, even when they should. If this case happened today, with modern medical understanding, with heightened awareness of investigative bias, with greater skepticism of absolute claims, would the outcome be the same? No one can answer that, and that may be the most haunting part of all. Some true crime stories end with handcuffs, others end with verdicts. This one ends with silence. A silence filled with doubt, with unresolved grief, with the knowledge that the truth may sit somewhere between what was said and what was proven. The babysitter's story didn't add up, but neither was the certainty that condemned her. And somewhere in that space between doubt and belief, the truth may still be waiting. Thank you for watching. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Unimaginable True Crimes, because the next case is even harder to forget.